is a model. Most of the models you're going to see, by the way, over the next 8 weeks are things that Ben and I have created over our career. So they're not going to be things that you can look up per se, but they are going to things that Ben and I have shown to be true through our experiences as practitioners, which I think is one of the reasons Dr. Ben Wood asked the practitioners to come and teach this class. And before I do that, I'm supposed to be recording this, right?
I think we just started recording.
Yeah,
Did
Chris,
we- did you do
I just restarted the recording
she
for
got it.
us.
She got
I
it.
got
Thank
you.
you,
I got
Brittany.
you.
While you were out, I said I was going to do it, and then I didn't. So,
It's okay.
anyway,
I'm
we're all
here for
good.
you. I got
We're
your
back.
back.
Thank you, Brittany.
course.
So business is ultimately three things. Operations. What are you doing that's generating revenue or market share or whatever it is your business does, right? That's essentially operations. You could put sales in here. You can put operations or manufacturing here. Anything your company does to win is operations. That's essentially the first leg of the business stool. The second is finance, and we also we think about finance as money, but what money actually is to a company is the ability to store and move value around. You might move value that you made in one part of the business over to a new part of the business or to a struggling part of the business so that you can make it better. But money to a business is like blood. It moves around the body so that the body can do interesting things. So finance is all about storing and moving value around the organization. And then the third leg of the business stool that people don't often talk about, but is really important, and if you're sitting in this class, you probably agree with us, is the people. That's one thing every single company on this planet has in common. It includes at least one human. Even the one guy who runs his own plumbing business out of his house is a company of one person. And so one of the coolest things about being an HR practitioner is you can work anywhere. Because last I checked, every company has humans, which means that humans need to be managed, supported, helped to do what they do. And so these three legs of the stool is what we call business. Do stuff, store and move value around, and then put the people lens in order to make those other things go. Now, it all ultimately in a business, even nonprofits, comes to the translation to financial outcomes. So this model that you see here on the bottom here is about how people outcomes, which is what we tend to do as practitioners, typically translates into some kind of business value. It's not always direct business value, like we recruited better and so we hired more people. Sometimes it's indirect value, like we made the culture better, so fewer people quit. And because fewer people quit, now the business is operating more effectively because we have better people and it costs less to keep our people. But the idea of becoming a really good practitioner in the space of human resources is always being able to translate your way back to business outcomes. Sometimes those business outcomes are directly financially measurable, and sometimes they're indirectly financially measurable. But it typically comes down to spending less money or less time doing something, meaning we save time, or increasing the amount of money that we have, which is in things like market share, revenue, and those sorts of things. So the idea of understanding this three-legged stool is saying, hey, our side is saying you can't forget the people lens of a business. But then the other side of that coin is us always saying, yeah, but we're also a business. And so how are we thinking about what our organization does and how we do it more efficiently or more effectively by adding the expertise of the people lens in order to do this kind of work? Ben, before I move on, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I was going to take a slight other point in that some of you may have heard, maybe all of you have heard, HR sometimes gets this tag of the soft, fluffy stuff, right? Oh, the business is the operations and the money. And a lot of times that people component gets missed. And when you strip it down even further, one very well-known IO psychologist that you may have read or will read in your studies is Dr. Steve Hunt at SAP, which is a big German software company. I've worked with Steve for a long time. And Steve actually defines a business a little differently than how we're defining it here. He defines it as a group of people using shared resources to accomplish shared goals. And that's a pretty good definition. And so it highlights how critical and crucial the people component of it. And back to Chris's point, that every single organization that you will work for or consult with or read about is going to be made up of people. And so it's really not correct and accurate to call what we do in analytics and HR and organizational psychology soft, because it's essential. It is as hard as it gets. It is getting to the root of the core of the business. So it's a little bit of a tangent, some color commentary, but I've always found that very fascinating to think about, that definition of an organization being a group of people using shared resources to accomplish shared goals. And then in practice, when we raise that up, Chris's definition here is really how most people look at it. Is it's the people, it's the operations, it's the finance, and ultimately that's what we have to do to have jobs, is to show the value that we're bringing in the work that we do with our people in an organization. So that's the only thing I would add there, Chris.
Yep, I appreciate it. The main point to take away is that what we do is not soft, it's not extra, it's not we're only doing it because we have to. The way that we make a difference is by showing up as educated business people who can speak operations, we can speak finance, and we can do it with a lens of people expertise that allows us to bring value that adds to the business, but also adds to the employee experience. And when we get down to talk a little bit about the Lorax, I'll opine on that a little bit more. So my slides sometimes mostly aren't super exciting, but I don't like to fill them up with tons of data, although there are some wordy ones here. But this idea of how anything happens in the space of strategic HR and most of business is this process here, right? We have to think something, either identify a problem, we have to decide what we're going to do about it, we have to design and or build something to do something after we made the decision, we got to implement it, and then if we're smart, we got to see if it actually worked, which is the assessment process. Most of what you do in project management, whether it's in HR or otherwise, lives in this space of recognizing and deciding, doing something about it, and then seeing if the doing something about it worked. And this might seem super elementary, but we're going to anchor a lot of what we do with how to do research and how to think about problems in this language. So, do stuff, right? That's the thing, the decide, the build, the implement. And then the impacts is the assess part. So when you think about do stuff that impacts business, we just spent a lot of time talking about how people provide value to business. And then we think through how think, decide, design, build, implement, and assess go along with that. What we're doing in this class is really helping you build skill sets in these three areas, right? So thinking and deciding is recognizing problems, articulating them, doing exploratory and constructive research about them, so that we can go off and make a really strong decision that's evidentially based. And then once we get to the end, we want to see if that thing worked. And this is where we get more into empirical research or other places where we're going to sort of build evidence to look backwards and see if the thing that we did actually mattered. And a major competitive differentiator, a few of you said you're either looking for jobs or you're in a job looking for something else. Being a practitioner, one of the most competitive differentiators you can have for yourself is an exceptional ability to creatively and logically apply reason to the interrogation, generation, and refinement of ideas. Thinking critically, understanding the business, bringing your expertise as an HR person to the business, and then being part of the business in a way that you can create advantage to how the business operates. Again, reducing the amount of time it takes to do something or increasing the amount of money the organization makes as a result. So always be thinking about how am I going to be able to be better at understanding the real problem, investigating that problem, creating data about that problem so that I can see what's happening. And a lot of what Dr. Ben and I are going to work with you all on over the next 8 weeks is starting with that concept of argumentation. Can I really pick apart an idea, an opportunity, a statement, and define it in the component parts that I can then measure? And if you watch the intro video that Dr. Ben and I recorded, we talked about that whole life cycle from idea to presentation.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to spend a lot of time on this front end, and we're going to move to, and that's really what we're going to spend the first couple of lectures on. Tyler.
Yes. For generation, can you give an example for that?
For the generation of ideas?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is essentially if you are being asked to be innovative in any way. So if they say, hey, we're having a problem with turnover. Can you figure out how to mitigate it? Or manager quality is kind of low and we don't really know what to do about it, right? So the generation of ideas is really what's coming from you sometimes, and sometimes you're interrogating others' ideas that have been generated. So essentially the idea of creating novel ideas about things. That's what I mean by generation. Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Any other questions before we keep going? Cool. All right. This class is going to introduce the skills, domains, frameworks, and techniques to do this work. So We can't do all of what you would need to be a statistician or a research methods expert or a philosophy major in the space of logic in the 8 weeks we have together. But we can introduce each of the major domains and skill sets, go a little bit deep in them, such that A, you can decide, I really love that part and I want to go deeper on that. Or you can decide, I know enough about this that I can now partner with other experts in the job I have today or the jobs I'm going to have in the future. So depending on what your ambitions are as a practitioner, you may want to look for things that you want to go deeper on, or you may want to just build a high enough level of familiarity with these concepts and domains that you can use it in your day-to-day life. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about the Lorax. Honest show of hands here. Who knew that there was a movie from 1970 and not the one with Danny DeVito in it before they logged into this? All right, I'm relatively proud of all of you. After I decided this, I was like, my gosh, I'm gonna feel super old maybe if nobody has actually been. Ben, you didn't grow up watching that one? Man,
I didn't.
Well,
You know, I saw I was like the original, and I was looking at the content. I was like, oh crap, I didn't know that.
so
It has such a
after-
weird time too. It's like 25 minutes. This is a Cartoon Network special. I'm surprised that we didn't see this.
Yeah, it totally is. And it's really just a dramatic reading of the book with a musical score added, right? It's pretty, if you've ever read the book, it's pretty true to the script of the movie is almost the actual book. Anyway, I won't go too far on this. I love Dr. Seuss. And he's very allegorical in the way he talks about and comments on society through his literature. And this story stuck with me from a very young age because it's a really good example of lack of balance, where the company and the concept of industry represented by the Onceler goes and has a great idea, and he's a good guy and he just wants to do good work, but he falls out of balance with his economy and he falls out of balance with his environment, and he ultimately, despite the protests of the Lorax, kind of destroys an entire species of tree, right? Why is that relevant to what we're going to do? Well, across the course, we're going to be giving you guys vignettes and data to play with and all these things. And you'll see that we kind of like put a little bit of a Onceler theme across that. So that's just a little bit of fun. But the thing I want you guys to think about most importantly here is that you will hear, if you haven't already heard in the space of HR, that there's this false dichotomy between doing what's good for business and doing what's good for people. And it is demonstrably nonsense. You can do both, and it is not good enough to pretend that we can't, right? And so the Lorax is an example of taking that concept and just saying, well, I'm going to do what's good at business and screw the environment, right? And it bites him, right? In our world, instead of the environment, it's really the employee experience. Are we exploiting people? Are we paying them enough? Are we taking care of them properly? And we will also often take short-term wins for long-term losses, right? So as HR practitioners, a huge part of what organizational researchers do is make that case. We're on the front lines of data saying, look, I know you don't think you need to take care of your toxic managers because they're really, really smart, but if you don't, their smartness is not going to outweigh your broken culture. And this is a hard case to make, but organizational researchers spend a lot of time doing this. I'm going to ask Ben to comment here because I'm sure he's got thoughts.
This is basically my job is to explain to other leaders why it's not one or the other. And I'll give you some really simple examples. Are you, I guess by a show of hands, anybody familiar with like the term the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, all these little things, right? After the pandemic happened, what we were doing at Qualtrics, we did a lot of research around how the employee experience and expectations were changing. And one of the things we saw after the pandemic started to slow down as companies moved into moving people to remote work and they started changing the way they operated was that employee expectations across the globe just shot way up. And so that then created a lot of problems for business leaders because when things cooled down and it was like, okay, it's time to get back people together, they didn't want to come back into the office. And we still deal with this return to office issue. There's going to be some vignettes that you'll see that reflect this. But what you're seeing now that there's somewhat of an economic downturn, inflation has spiked up, is that there is a huge amount of tension between the needs and the wants of employees and their expectations for what working conditions are and what leaders want to do for the business. And oftentimes they treat it as it's us or them. And that is, I'm just going to say the word, it's stupid. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense because it's a fundamental lack of understanding of what their business is and what makes it up, and that is the people. So this essentially is what I do for a living, is try to explain through data and research to other business leaders that you need to take care of your people because those are the people that are going to take care of the business, the operations, the finance, etc. So that's the only piece I would add. And we have a lot of research that we've done that we'll introduce throughout the course that you might find interesting on that piece. So I don't know. I'm curious. Any thoughts? Any examples of that you all have noticed, like in your own job or just in your own reading externally, or examples that are really salient to you?
I know with my own experience with my company, we're not a large company. We're about 585 employees, and we're pretty archaic in terms of how we do things. We're pretty stuck in the 80s. But what I've noticed is that COVID was a really big hit on production, which caused them to pull back in a lot of like fringe areas. And so they pulled back on a lot of the culture initiatives. Everyone went into survival mode. And so me coming into this company barely a month ago, I've been charged with rebooting all of these processes, but I realized that there's a lack of the internal infrastructure to actually support these processes because we lack the actual data collection, and we do a lot of just the descriptive statistics, the bare bones, which I know was described in the readings as being the most basic, and a lot of orgs rely on that. But I noticed that after COVID, everyone did go into survival mode. And so coming out of that, the few years, it's been hard to kind of sway leadership towards understanding that we should invest in certain things like survey platforms to understand how employees are feeling. And so it's been a bit of a challenge for me. So I definitely understand what you're talking about, and I'm experiencing that every day.
You just articulated the reason that Ben and I got on this little mini soapbox, right? And we feel passionately about this, but the reason to bring it up at the beginning of this particular course is that your currency for moving the minds and the hearts of business leaders is data and research, full stop. Because it's objective, it's not emotional, it is logic-based. And when you can do it in the terms of outcomes that matter to the business, whether that's headcount, or its revenue, or its turnover rates, or its market share, or its marketing touches, that's when you move the hearts and minds, when you can speak in the language of the business. And so we're going to learn a lot about how to do that this semester. Any other examples? Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing.
I'm interested in Stuart's point here. I'm curious if you could explain that a little better. I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying.
Okay, so for example, at my neighborhood church, they opened 30 years ago, and the neighborhood around them, it's all being gentrified. There's like malls opening up, there's new apartment centers, new town halls, all that stuff, and they're stuck in a bubble where like we don't know how to, as a church, evolve into this community and stay afloat with them. And I mentioned the Up movie because in Up, Carl, everything around him is businesses, towers, big skyscrapers, and he's stuck on the same thought of I want to keep my house this way because this is my comfort zone. So in a way, like that affects growth. If that's kind of my understanding of why I said gentrification, because in a way it does it, like companies or like businesses such as my church, it's not a business but it's a church, they're stuck in a bubble where they can't evolve because they're still stuck with what they're used to from 30 years ago compared to what's going on around them, which is all this gentrification, all these wealthy middle class people coming in and creating all these businesses and them just trying to keep up.
I think that's a really good observation, Stuart. I actually agree with that. I do think that has something to do with it, where oftentimes you'll see when a business practice is in place, for example, just to kind of take it to what we're going to be talking about in this course, It's incredibly difficult, especially when it's already built in the minds of executives. A great one that I see all the time is when companies run big organizational surveys of their workforce. And what oftentimes they'll do is they'll have targets for things like employee engagement. And they'll pay executives money to get over a certain number. And when that practice, that's a terrible practice for the record. We can get into why later. Terrible practice. But if that's happening in an organization and you as a consultant are trying to convince them to stop doing it, it is incredibly difficult to get them to change. And they're in their comfort zone, they're in that motion. The change management is too hard. We don't want to invest the resources to do the change management. That, what you just talked about, Stuart, is something that you will face in working for a company or in your consulting. And honestly, to Chris's point, that's why being armed with an ability to think logically, to use data appropriately to support, when you can show the data in the terms that the leaders, like dollars and cents, for example, how does turnover drive dollars and cents? How does what they're doing it hurt dollars and cents, which you're going to be armed to do after this course? Now you can get them to move. Now you can get them to change. And so that's a very good observation, Stuart. I like that example.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. We're going to jump in to our first topic that we're going to deal with, and that is the concept of argumentation. So I hope you guys had a chance to watch Professor Victor Gijsberg from the Netherlands. He ran through a bunch of videos about logic, and you may have started and thought, why? Like, I took philosophy, or maybe I didn't take philosophy. Either way, I'm in an HR grad program now. Why are these guys making me watch stuff on argumentation? Because the idea of logic and building and articulating a case is the essence of all research, right? Most people spend their whole lives having ideas and discussing ideas, but they don't often, unless they take philosophy in college or they become a researcher, explore the actual frameworks of logic that help them think and argue more effectively, right? We've all had an argument before. We've all thought we were right. Sometimes we win those arguments, sometimes we lose those arguments, but the idea is creating a case and then defending it or prosecuting it is a huge part of what it takes to do research. And we're going to talk in detail about it because it's one of the most important skill sets we want you guys to walk away with from this course. And the first thing to say is that an argument in this case is not a disagreement. When we use the word argument, what we mean is your view on a thing, right? Which is a reason or set of reasons that you're going to use to persuade others that an action or idea is right or wrong. You might do this if you have a child that you're convincing to eat their vegetables, or you may do it with an executive that you're trying to convince, right, to invest in a survey platform. But the idea is that we all start, that's where the verb argument or where the noun argument that we use every day comes from. It comes from this idea of having your view and putting it up against other views. Constructing and analyzing arguments is the essence of evidence-based decision-making, right? Why do you think you're right? Can you explain it to others effectively? Can you understand and interpret others' arguments effectively? And can you synthesize argumentative components and then create new ones? So back to Tyler's point before about what do you mean by generation, right? Because when you mush ideas together, sometimes new stuff pops out, right? Sometimes your argument and their argument ends up not being the right answer, right? JFK famously said, I'm not looking for the Democratic answer or the Republican answer. I'm looking for the right answer, right? And so a huge amount of what we do in science and engineering, which we'll get into, is being ruthless about testing your arguments, but then also always allowing yourself to be wrong. That's an incredibly important part of doing research well, is always being open to not having the right answer, because that's the only way that you really, really move forward. And this ties back nicely to Stuart's example of the gentrification, because a huge amount of getting stuck in a business or in a business model is the idea of not really being open to change and not really being open to the idea that what you're doing is not working and you need to change in order to survive. So this is a huge, important part of constructing and analyzing arguments. Stuart, you got a question?
Yes. So I kind of, in a way, have like a counter argument to like change, because I'm gonna use my church for example. They're going through this change, right? And all the old school people that have been there 20 plus years, they're not liking this new transition, so it's causing them to not want to come back, or little by little they're disengaging. What if, like, sometimes I feel like change isn't it couldn't be, that's just me though, it couldn't be the answer, although sometimes it is the answer. But like in a place like, let's say, this organization or this church, with change, it causes people want to leave because they're not used to it. So it causes, like, in a way, in a business perspective, it causes to lose clients or lose customers.
Yeah, Stuart, you've got a really good point, and you're acknowledging the messiness of practical decision making. Because for if you make a decision as your church and there are people that don't come back as a result of that, that could be a loss. But if you make that decision knowing that it may create other people who want to come, you as a business owner get to decide whether or not you make that choice. And unfortunately, we like to think of the world as black and white, and there's mustache twirling villains and superheroes. But that's not the way people are, right? Everybody's more complicated than that. Every decision you make is going to have pros and cons. And in business, it's not usually about finding out the truth and having the sky open up and then knowing exactly what to do. It's usually about making hard trade-offs with the decision and the data that you have, and acknowledging that some people aren't going to want your product when you made this choice, but you think that more people are going to want it, and so you have to go in that direction. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it acknowledges the messiness of what we do, because no researcher, especially in the social sciences, has ever run out with that eureka moment and everything was butterflies and rainbows after that. There are always, always hard choices that have to be made. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, let's talk a little bit more about argumentation. The two primary parts of an argument are your premises, which are the components of your argument, and then your conclusions, which are the novel insight your premises create. All New Orleans Saints fans wear New Orleans Saints hats. Dr. Ben is wearing a New Orleans Saints hat. Therefore, Dr. Ben is a New Orleans Saints fan, right? Even if I didn't state it that formally, we could probably infer that Dr. Ben likes the Saints because of the hat he's wearing. But the idea, the actual formula that my mind went through, whether I knew it or not, is that I collected some data, the hat that Ben was wearing, and then I made an inference about it. I concluded that he's probably a fan of the Saints. I may even go further and say he has a strong dislike for the Atlanta Falcons. Not because he's wearing anything that shows that, but because I can make inferences off of my conclusions. So when we think about this concept, and we're going to use these terms a lot in this course, premises are the things that we know to be true or we think to be true, and we'll talk about the difference there in a minute. The conclusion is the novel insight that I get from that. And then the important leap I have to make there is something that we call an inference, right? And that is the beginning of the word inferential statistics, right? The concept of an inference is getting from the thing you can observe to the thing that you think. And these are really incredibly important components, because when you get into the real workplace, they're not going to state it that clearly. They're going to throw a bunch of word vomit at you about what's broken, and you're going to have to sift through that and figure out what are they actually worried about, and then define it in a way that we can test it. And we're going to get more into that soon. Now, we're going to talk about the difference between deductive and inductive arguments, because and if you read about this in chapters 1 through 3, and all the argumentation videos talked about this, arguments can be deductive or they can be inductive. And it's really important to understand the difference. I will be honest with you, you can spend a whole college career on the difference between these things. But for the sake of practical application, you can think of deductive as top-down argumentation, right? Which means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, right? All New Orleans Saints fans wear hats, right? Dr. Ben is wearing a New Orleans Saints hat, therefore, Dr. Ben is a New Orleans Saints fan. The second one is true. He's very clearly wearing that hat. But not all New Orleans Saints fans necessarily wear New Orleans Saints hats. Maybe his dad or mom was a big fan and he got the hat from them, but he actually doesn't care about football at all, right? So we assume that those two things were true for the sake of the deductive argument. But if those two premises are true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true, which is different than inductive, where if the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to be true. And this is a much more common way that we make argumentation, right? If we open up the refrigerator and the milk is empty, We can tell our spouse, my gosh, why did you finish the milk, right? And that might seem like a pretty airtight case that you got there, but it is possible philosophically that somebody snuck into the house, drank the milk, and then left. Not likely, but it is technically possible, which makes that argument inductive. So the idea of bottomed up argumentation, and Dr. Heisberg talks about this a lot better than I can, so I really encourage you to engage with those videos. He talks about how when you get into the idea of inductive reasoning, you need to add assumptions in order to understand what you're doing. And a lot of science is based on that. If we had to reprove every single thing, we would never really get where we needed to go when it came to argumentation. And we're going to talk about that more later. But the point of these two things to juxtapose for practical argumentation is deductive is great, but it tends to be inflexible, it tends to be slow, and it's more difficult than you think to come up with a really true, absolutely immutable deductive fact, right? Especially in practical applications. Inductive is a lot more flexible and it's faster, but what you give up for it is a little bit of the surety. And Ben, I saw you unmuted, so I think you got something.
I was just going to throw out a really simple one. In if you're like a fan of Sherlock Holmes and you used to read the books or you watch the old show or the new show or the new movies, he often says, "I deduced that," but really what he's doing is he's inferring. So he talks a lot about deduction, but what Sherlock is actually doing is inductive reasoning. And as Chris is going to talk about, it gets complicated because what we do in science and what we do in organizational research is largely inductive, but we want to do it as deductively as possible, if that makes sense. So we'll explain a little bit more of that.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So research as essentially the art and science of systematically testing your premises and conclusions to see if they hold up. Sometimes it's easy to fall into the idea of that we only test conclusions, but a ton of what we do in research, especially organizational research, is testing premises. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute, but it's really important to understand that premises and conclusions can be attacked with research, and we need to, because oftentimes business leaders will have inappropriate assumptions that they're using as a premise to reach a conclusion. Does that sentence make sense? I want to say it one more time. Oftentimes business leaders will have an incorrect premise that they're using to infer a conclusion.
Maybe let's stop here, Chris. Like, I'm curious if anybody has a good example of that in your work life. Incorrect
Right.
premise. Yeah.
I mean, I would say a lot of leadership or management have certain ideas about millennials, and a lot of times people are labeling millennials. So if you are a certain age or born in a certain year, then you must be lazy or you don't want to work hard, or I mean, that would be my example.
That's a great
example.
Perfect example.
Stuart.
Can I add one?
Oh, Stuart and Tyler. Stuart and Tyler.
I want to say religion. Religion,
Explain.
because they say, for instance, a Christian, they're not allowed to, let's say, just an example, like they're not allowed to have any sex or anything like that unless they're with their spouse and they get married. That could be an example of like why religion. Another one could be a good Christian compared to a Catholic. One believes in the Virgin Mary, one just believes in Christ. For a Catholic, they believe in the Virgin Mary. They believe in others rather than just God.
Okay.
Gotcha. So
I
making
see what you're saying.
assumptions about
Yeah,
somebody
making
based on a label
assumptions.
that they have.
Right.
Tyler.
So HRBP making a decision that the hires are less of a quality because we had two people quit back to back, but like they had different situations and other people working out. So just kind of like assuming that, okay, there's something wrong with recruiting.
Gotcha. So making an assumption based on a limited number of observations that there's a problem somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a good one, Tyler. That's a classic too. It's like what everybody blames first. They blame training, the training department, and then they blame recruiting, right? So, but it's all right. That's a good example. Yeah.
Well, the training department blames recruiting first, but everybody else blames training first. All right. So let's put an argumentation out there to talk about something that looks airtight, right? Male animals do not have uteruses. A uterus is required to be pregnant. This fish is male. Therefore, this fish is not pregnant, right? And for every animal in the world, except for two, that's true. Yeah, pretty, Rebecca, I love that your face went like, what? So, in case you didn't know, seahorses and sea dragons are the only two animals in the world where the male is actually the one who gets pregnant, carries the babies, and gives birth, right? It's a strange, unusual evolutionary phenomenon, but the point is, no amount of observations in science ever proves that you can't ever have a counterexample. So no matter how good science is and how far we get in it, we have to be respectful of the fact that we can always potentially be wrong. And any given observation can prove us wrong, because no amount of white swans proves all swans are white when a single black swan proves that they're not. Tyler, you had your hand up? Nope, you're good.
Yeah,
Professor,
I was
can
about
you?
to ask.
Oh, sorry, were you gonna ask a question, Tyler? I was just wondering if you could repeat real quick the statement you said before the example about the white swans. You were so the overarching of what that example proves.
Yes, that the reason science is inductive is because it's always based on observations. And no amount of observations that we ever have is going to outlaw the idea that the next observation might not be counterintuitive, right? There's a famous saying about physics that it is true that in tomorrow apples may start to rise, but the evidence doesn't warrant equal time in the classroom, right? So there are plenty of things that we've created enough evidence about that we can treat as fact. And science spends a lot of time basing what it does on the facts that we've shown beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the idea of science is that we're always going out and testing those premises and testing those conclusions. We have to rest on some of them, and scientists do a ton of work there. But as a practitioner, you're going to find that you're dealing in the gray a lot. Like Stuart said earlier about the fact that some people may choose to leave the church when I make this choice, and some may want to come because of it. There's always that challenge. And so I just want to make sure that when we talk about argumentation, we respect that idea that science is fundamentally iterative and that we're always collecting new evidence, and that oftentimes the science we have works really well at the size of populations or companies, but that doesn't necessarily give us license to treat every individual in a certain way because of that aggregated impact. So I talked about this a little bit before, but I want to dive into it a little bit deeper now. An argumentation's premises and conclusions have separate validity concerns. If a premise is false, you can create a valid argument that reaches an invalid conclusion. And that might sound weird, but we just spent a little bit of time talking about that, right? Males don't have uteruses, therefore a male seahorse can't be pregnant, right? People are quitting because we don't pay enough, therefore we should pay them more. That's an example, right? That is very common in the world of compensation strategy. Now, the terminology that I want you all to take away from this and learn from is the difference between a sound argument and a valid argument. Sound argument, valid argument. A sound argument is an argument where the premises and conclusion make sense. A valid argument is where the conclusion can be accurately inferred from the premises. So let's talk about 4 examples, right? John is a certified public accountant. All CPAs have to pass a certification exam. Therefore, John is good at math. That's a sound argument, right? I can probably make a reasonable case that if he's passed the CPA exam, he's pretty decent at math. But just because he's a certified public accountant and just because he's passed that exam doesn't mean technically that he has to be good at mathematics. Those literal statements don't add up to the deductive conclusion that he's good at math. So it's a sound argument, but it's not really a valid argument. Now, let's take the next example. All birds are purple. Polly is a bird. Therefore, Polly is purple. Now, that's a valid argument because if all birds are purple and if Polly is a bird, then Polly must be purple. But what do we know? We know that not all birds are purple. So you have a valid argument that is not sound. Like everybody is quitting because we don't pay enough. We're assuming the cause before we get to the conclusion. And you see this a lot in organizations. And it's something that researchers have to break down and say, well, and we're giving you a language to think about this. Like, what is the premise that you're working with? And is it actually true? Can you demonstrate that that premise is true? Can you demonstrate the relationship between your premise that we don't pay enough and your conclusion that people are quitting because of it? Challenging premises is huge. Third, valid and sound. John is an accountant. All birds are purple. Therefore, the Rams will win the Super Bowl. That just sounds like, right, ridiculousness. And it is, because you can't follow the logic and it doesn't make any sense. So that one's probably easy. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. All Rams players wear blue and gold uniforms. Matt Stafford is a player for the Rams. Therefore, Matt Stafford wears a blue and gold uniform, right? Logical and valid, meaning we know that if all Rams wear blue and gold uniforms, and if Matt Stafford is a player for the Rams, he, by definition, has to wear a blue and gold uniform when he plays. And it is also sound. It makes sense that if he's part of a team and that team wears a particular set of colors, that he probably wears those colors. Now, I know this sounds like I'm getting really super deep on the argumentation concept, but no matter if you don't know a lick about research methods or statistics or data, the idea of being able to beat up ideas as a function of understanding premises, conclusions, what's valid, what's sound, and can you reverse engineer from someone's opinion back to the premises that they might not even know they have to help you get to the root of the problem that you're actually attacking is in and of itself a valuable skill set, independently of all the stuff we're going to do in this course.
And I would add on that point, that is, as we move into a world where machines are going to start to augment work more and more, and that's only going to accelerate. At the end of the decade, we're likely to move into quantum computing, which is going to make the computers that we're using here essentially obsolete when we get older. That skill set of being able to take a statement and dissect it into its component parts is a very human skill. And that is one that's going to serve you really well. And so, as a good example, we alluded to this in our intro video, that in this course, we're going to touch on lots of statistical techniques, how to run these things in Excel. You're going to learn a little bit about how to do. But our goal, Chris and I's goal, is really to help you to learn to think like a scientist. Machines can't take that away from you. So that's a really, really critical skill. And this, what Chris is going through here, that ability to take that statement and start to dissect it and break it down is going to be a big part of the work we're going to have you do over the next, really honestly, throughout the entire course. So this is not these are kind of crazy examples here, but this ability to break this down is super critical and not something that the machines can take away from you.
Yeah, and a quick additional plug on the machine learning and AI aspect, right? Every piece of machine learning or AI that's produced is trained and built with a set of rules. And sometimes those rules are made by the human, and sometimes they're initially made by the human, and the machine makes more rules as it goes, right? And this isn't a machine learning course, so we won't get into that. But any algorithm that's producing something, that's telling you to make a decision based on a prediction of some kind, by definition, has had to make assumptions to get there, right? And it has always started with a set of premises. I decided to train this algorithm with these features. These features are data that represent something. And now those are creating the prediction that are causing me to make this decision. So another additional skill, in addition to what Ben was saying about logical reasoning, is the ability to challenge what premises, assumptions, and conclusions were made in the development of an algorithm or a piece of AI that is now asking you to do something. If you haven't had this experience already, you may in your career, where the machine is predicting something and you have a practical person saying, that doesn't make sense. I don't know why the machine is telling me to do it. I don't know why. Has anybody gotten like a really weird suggestion on Netflix where it's like, I have no idea why the hell it would want me to watch that, right? That's just a recommendation engine. And it's right more than it's wrong, right? Which is pretty good. But those outlier events are the kinds of things that make or break human experiences at work. Because imagine it's not just a bad exception or a bad recommendation for work. Imagine it's, I didn't get into the hypo program. Imagine it's, I got selected for the RIF because of this. The stakes are higher in the work that we do, and it requires a different level of scrutiny for when we decide to give decisions up to the machines. So it's a whole nother world. I think we have a chapter on it sometime that we're reading in this course, but we'll get back to that. Okay, so now we're going to take some time and we're going to practice. I'm going to drop you all into pairs. And I think, how many people do we have? We have 16 people in. So we can break evenly into 8 groups of 2. And I want you guys to, if you want to review the premises and conclusions from the logic video, it's the first one from 45 to 3:30. And then second, I want you and your partner to create 2 deductive arguments. So airtight arguments that are valid and sound that you can share with us. Bonus points if they're HR or work related, but they don't have to be. So take some time. I want you all to practice. I'm going to go to more, and I'm going to go to breakout rooms, and I'm going to go to 8, and I'm going to hit create, and I'm going to bring everybody back at 12 minutes after, and then we're going to spend a few minutes discussing what you guys came up with. Sound good? Any questions before I hit go? Sweet. Ready, set, go. All right.
Ben,
All
I like the thinking. I like the thinking.
I won't put anyone on blast, but the first person that came back, I said, how was it? And they went. So this is hard, right? This is hard. It's funny because when you say it out loud, it's like, all right, yeah, man, I win arguments every day. This is easy, right? And then when you actually try to get down to the brass tacks of breaking out your arguments and making them really airtight, you figure out real quick that the logical parts of breaking these pieces down isn't as easy as it seems on the surface. So I would love to hear from a few folks. We're going to spend about 10 minutes, 9 minutes ish talking through some of this, and we're going to save some time for the end because we have one more, I think, breakout to do before we end tonight. But how did it go? Anybody jump in? Let me know.
Okay.
Sorry.
No,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go for it, Stuart.
Okay. Well, Ben and I had a good time. We came up with 2. The second one was harder, only because we were trying to keep it between the topics I've been talking about, which was church, gentrification, all that. But for the first one, that one came pretty easy. Well, not pretty easy, but pretty quick. We said that all the people who attend my church on Sunday are Christian. Tom attends my church on Sundays, therefore he is a Christian.
That's fair. Is it airtight? Anybody have votes?
I don't think it's
not
airtight.
because, yeah, what if Tom's coming with his girlfriend or trying to become a Christian or just wants to learn about God in a different religion than his own?
That's true. Christianity is evangelical and fundamentally inclusive. It is probably not true that every person that has ever been inside a church is Christian. That's a good point, Tyler.
Yep, and for our second one, this is gonna be a little fun for you. If people are paid more, they are motivated to work. Sally makes more than John, therefore Sally is more motivated than John.
Oh, Ben, you loaded that one in. What do we all think about that one?
I don't think that's airtight.
Not even close.
I'm glad you guys put that in. This isn't a theory class on compensation strategy, but we all know that how much you get paid is a small part of the employee value proposition. So
No, Stewart knows that is actually a motivator for me. So I would definitely work more if I got paid more. I'm showing up harder than you.
Quick fun fact. Can I give a quick fun fact from research to Tyler's point, right? So normally there's a lot of research on this in organizational psychology. Pay is one of those things where you run a survey and everybody wants to get paid more. It's not a great predictor of motivation, with one major exception: sales employees. Huge motivator for sales employees. So there you go.
All right.
And that's exactly why we threw that in there, because we thought we would have some fun with that one.
Nice. Chelsea, what you got?
So I was partnered with Julie, and this was actually really difficult. And we came up with 1 because we kept doing what we just did. We would say one, and then we would be like, no, this isn't airtight. I don't think this is deductive. And we would delete. And then before you knew it, 12 minutes was up. So the one we came up with was: most millennials work hard. My employees are millennials. Therefore, most of my employees work hard.
I like the hedge. Who can identify what the hedge in the argument is? It's one word.
Can you repeat it one more time though, Chelsea?
Sure. Most millennials work hard. My employees are millennials. Therefore, most of my employees work hard.
Who can spot the
The
hedge?
therefore, the hedge is
most, and
therefore
they're
most of
throwing me
mine.
off.
Us?
One word. Julia, what?
It's most.
Most.
Yeah, Becca
Most
got
is
it.
the hedge.
Yep.
It's the greatest hedge in the world that you will hear from organizational practitioners. Oh, so we can say we can go do this. Well, Ben, what are the two words? Well, it depends.
It depends. Oh man, oh, I want to attack that so much, but I'm gonna leave it. Go ahead.
So yes, it is airtight, and it's airtight because you hedged with the word most, right? Which isn't an attack, by the way. It's a good argument that we can say, in general, most millennials work hard. Maybe we have some research that shows that. Therefore, because my workforce is millennials, most of them work hard. But I do want to point out that a lot of what we do is use approximators. And if you want to go deep into deductive reasoning, you can watch some videos on syllogisms, which is the actual formula invented by Aristotle for deductive arguments. And you will see that words like most are not allowed. It's all, none, right? And if you start introducing words like some or most or usually or sometimes, it's not truly deductive anymore because you're sort of inserting that unsurety with your language. Now, it's very practical and usable, but as we create premises and conclusions, we have to be open to the difference between all and must and sometimes and most. So I'm really glad actually you brought it up, Chelsea, because it gave us an opportunity to kind of talk about the language that we were using. I think we'll probably do one more. Who wants to jump in?
I can jump in.
We can
Oh,
do two more. so
Tyler, I saw your hand raised. I'm
No.
sorry.
Becca, then Ty. We'll do two.
I was
I'm
so
glad you
worried
asked.
because I didn't have my screen.
I'm sorry, Ty.
Appreciate you. Know, hey, Becca, you can go first since they said we can do.
I'll go quick. Yeah, I'll go quick. So Bailey and I, we each kind of came up with one. The first one was, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And then the second one was, all professional soccer players wear shin guards. Alex Morgan is a soccer player, therefore Alex Morgan wears shin guards.
I think so. The first one is right out of the syllogism textbook. So that is like the quintessential deductive argument. So I'm glad you guys nailed that one. And I think you probably got that one. One of you must have watched the Fayette State professor video because that he talks about that one. So I like that. And the Alex Morgan one, what do we think about that one? Team, what do we think?
Can I add one quick comment? Bailey and I talked about this, and we were originally going to say all soccer players, but then we talked about the fact that there might be a 4-year-old somewhere that forgot his shin guards for practice. And then the coach said, you know what, we're just shooting goals today, so it's fine. So we narrowed it down to all professional soccer players, since it's probably more strict in the professional
So
sphere.
how might we make that even more specific, Becca? I'm gonna throw this one in here. So all professional soccer players wear shin guards when they're playing in professional matches.
Yes.
Because I bet you Alex Morgan doesn't wear shin guards in the shower, probably.
That's a good
right?
point.
So she wears them, but she wears them at very specific times, right? So
Very.
the idea that we're getting at here, right, is that as we get deeper into our definitions, and when we get to testable phrases and the vignettes and operational definitions and hypotheses, you're going to see how that specificity matters a lot. Because when you're making a statement like all professional soccer players wear shin guards, it might seem airtight until you think about the exceptions, like the 4-year-old, or when they're not playing soccer. And that can defeat what seems like an airtight argument. And when we're trying to test our premises and our conclusions, we can't always handle everything, but we can acknowledge what the limitations of our statements are. Tyler.
So I just wanted to go just because Marina's probably going to be like, oh, we struggled, but she helped create both of these. She was great at it. Engineering in the state of California must make over $110,000 to be salaried employees. John is a level 1 software engineer who makes $101,000. He is an hourly employee.
Give that to me one more time.
Engineering in the state of California must make $110,000 a year to be a salaried employee. John is a level 1 software engineer who makes $101,000 a year. Therefore, John is an hourly employee.
Gotcha. So, what do we think about that one?
I think I got lost in all the words.
Well, there is some.
Is
there
the
some-
number, are the numbers the same at the end? Are the numbers the
No,
same
they're
or they're not
different.
the
They're
same?
different.
Okay.
So it's like
Then yes.
101 to 110. He's $9,000 below what you need to make to be a salaried
Right.
employee.
So
So
by
I would-
the fact that he's below a threshold is negating.
I would say that's not airtight because there are a lot of companies out there that mistakenly or knowingly do not pay the California minimum salary.
Well,
And
that
I
might make it
was,
sound, but it does not necessarily make it valid, right? Because if he's saying, for the sake of the argument, all employees must make over this,
Mhm.
right? It
So it's
sounds, but
valid.
what you're challenging is the premise. You're saying, look, I'm
So it's not-
challenging your
it's not
premise that they all have to make over 110, which is a good call out because it challenges the soundness of the argument, but not necessarily the validity of the logic. There's another really important miss there that I want to call out. It's an assumption that you guys probably didn't even know that you made.
Real
Why is
quick.
hourly the opposite of salaried? We all know that to be true, but in the words that you have in your argument, there's no assumption. Remember, a deductive argument has to require no assumptions, right? And the difference between the dichotomy of hourly versus salary is an assumption that you made. It's sound, but you have to know something about the difference between salaried and hourly employees in order for that argument to be truly sound and valid.
So I should have said he's not a salaried employee.
Correct.
I see. And so my argument was sound, but it was it was valid, but it was not sound.
It was valid. Well, it lacked validity because of the salaried versus hourly, and it lacked soundness because we know not everybody in California pays that way.
Okay.
All right. So I'm glad you guys had fun with this. I'm very
But
grateful.
it looks
you
like
all-
Bailey might.
Oh,
You have a question,
Can we
Bailey?
share our second one too?
Bailey.
Because I think we did the second one better.
yes. Let's do the question before we move off of this one, and then we'll come back to yours.
Yeah, because I just had a question regarding his first one. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't there exemptions to in California of having to put people on salary? Because like for me, I'm a manager and technically, legally, managers are supposed to make salary, but I do not because of the employee number. Like if you only have a certain amount of employees, they don't technically have to give you salary. Am I correct in saying that?
It's like the different business sizes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of managers that have the title, but not necessarily given a salary.
Right.
Right.
So
So
I don't
when-
think it's a legal
if
thing.
we were making this argument in a practical setting, Bailey, your point is well taken. What I would say as a consultant to Tyler, who told me that, would be, well, what do we mean by manager? Right? What does manager mean in the eyes of the state of California? We might mean only people that work at a company of a certain size. We might mean somebody who works a certain amount of hours. We might mean somebody who's in a specific employee class, right? Based on, any number of things. I'm glad I don't do employment law in California. Let's put it that way. I've dealt with it a lot, but it's not the easiest place to do employment law. But what you're pointing out, Bailey, is that, okay, the premise is a complicated one to get underneath. And I think, Chelsea, you called out some things. Bailey, you called out some things. And getting specific into that premise would be an important part of making that argument more airtight, right? And you might add language to pad it, Tyler, like, managers in state governments or managers of employees over X number of employees, or something that adds and contextualizes what do you mean when you say manager in a way that defines it and leaves less up for interpretation. All right, what was your guys' second one? Marina.
It was the HR department deals with a lot of people. Emily works in the HR department. Emily talks to a lot of people at work.
Thoughts? Say it one more time for the benefit of the crowd. And I
The
love,
HR
wait, is that a little one in the background? That's amazing. Or is it
What?
I see some movement behind you.
Oh, my boyfriend, sorry.
Oh,
Disturbing, I know.
I thought it was a kid.
No, not a kid, not a kid. But it was The HR department talks to a lot of people. Emily talks to a lot of people at work.
Did everyone get that? Thoughts?
Any amendments anybody would make to it to make it more airtight?
I think the only thing I would say is what helps me is like using the same words. I think you said the first one was deals with a lot of people, and then the second one was talks to a lot of people. So I would just say like talks and talks
Yep.
for like consistency.
I think that was the only thing that I could think of that made that not a perfect deductive argument, right?
I actually
If A-
changed it and then went back. So that's great.
If A, then B, or B, A is B, B is C, therefore A is C, right? And again, if you guys are really interested in this, you can Google the concept of syllogism, and in about 15 minutes, they'll break it out. In fact, you know what? I have a good video on it that I was like, this is going to snooze people. I'll send it out to the group so that you guys can see it. And you can see that there's literally a formula of the words, and you guys did it perfectly. In HR, people talk to a lot of people. This person is in HR. Therefore, this person talks to a lot of people. If A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. Really, really good. All right. I'm glad you guys had fun with that exercise. It's Ben can tell you from years of knowing me that I love arguing. And so this to me is really great because a huge part of what we do is in the service of the organizations that we serve, break these ideas down and really get a chance to interrogate them. And this was like a little taste of being able to do that. So Ben said this earlier, but I do want to discuss this concept of deductive versus inductive, right? Because the sticky part is that science has to make assumptions, right? And I want to go back to Tyler's point about the hourly versus salary. Imagine if every single time you were going to make a discussion about employee class, you had to go back and explain to everybody the difference between hourly and salary employees. You'd never get anything done if you had to explain every single assumption every single time, right? It just doesn't work. And so we have to treat some things as fact. Tyler inadvertently, and I love the example, assumed we knew the difference between hourly and salary employees. And why wouldn't he? We're all graduate level IO practitioners here. We, of course, know that difference. And a ton of what we do in science is have to appreciate and respect the fact that there are assumptions out there. So we're not telling you not to treat assumptions with respect. What we're telling you to do is know that they're assumptions and know when it's time to push on an assumption or premise and when it's time to leave it alone. Because there are times where assumptions are perfectly reasonable and premises should be held true and you don't need to reprove them. And there are other times where you have to be thoughtful and say, I don't really like that premise. I don't know why we're assuming that. I don't know why we're assuming that we think that this shift differential actually matters to people. I don't know why we're assuming that if we just throw another 25 cents at them every single year, we're going to fix our turnover problem. There are premises out there that you need to leave alone because they make good sense, and there are ones that you need to fight. And so science has to stay deductive, meaning we have to go out there and not accept the assumptions because we have to dig into very particular questions. But we also want to make sure that we leave ourselves open to exploring the world of inductive. Ben, do you have thoughts on this?
No, nothing to add at this point.
Cool. All right, we've got about 30 minutes left, and I think we have one more concept. We're actually, if you guys don't mind, we're going to skip this one for now, only because I want to make sure that we have a full 20 minutes for the last breakout that we do, and I want to get through this next concept. So we're going to talk about discover versus do. One of the best watched videos, meaning most of you watched it and most of you got all the way through it, is the spotlight from the Boston Museum, talking about science versus engineering. It might have seemed a little strange that I was giving you a teacher's guide to science versus engineering, but it was the best video I could find that really talks about the difference between what science is and what engineering is. And these things are often hyper conflated. And applied organizational psychology degrees often tell you about science and teach you to be a scientist, but then they never tell you that when you go get a job, you're going to spend 80% of your time engineering stuff. not really doing the sciencey part. And so Dr. Ben and I thought it was really important to spend some time breaking out the difference between these things. We're going to do the first half of the model today, and then we're going to pick up on Tuesday with the second half of the model before we get into the back half of the lecture. So, science. Science is about knowing more. If you don't take anything away from today, well, the argumentation stuff is pretty important, so please take that away. But in addition to that, I would really like you guys to think about the idea that science is fundamentally about the expansion of knowledge, understanding more about the world that we live in and being able to explain, and importantly, predict outcomes based on the things that we know. The idea of science is expanding your knowledge. Engineering, in a complementary way, is about applying things to build useful stuff, right? If you're a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer or an electrical engineer, these things are very obvious to us because we're building physical things. HR practitioners don't typically build physical things. We build e-learning curriculums. We build management training programs. We build employee engagement programs. We re-engineer processes for how we hire people. We build abstract things that make the HR engine go, that make businesses work. We also interrogate those things and make them better when they're not optimized. But the difference between science, understanding how something works and why it works, and engineering, building something that works, are fundamentally different things. And this course is really about learning how to think like a scientist and act like an engineer. So I'm going to go through the concept of science right now and break it down. And I apologize if this gives you guys PTSD back to grade school or grammar school and the scientific method. But we're going to talk through it. And then we're going to do a quick exercise, and then we'll wrap up for tonight, and we'll be back tomorrow evening. So, every advancement humans have ever made started with this thing that kind of makes us interesting as humans, right? Observing and wondering. You see that the apple falls next to Newton, he wonders what the heck is going on, and then we discover gravity, right? The idea of observing and wondering is somewhat fundamentally human, right? Because our frontal cortexes have evolved somewhat uniquely to be able to imagine things that don't exist, right? And that is a really interesting component. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget is very well known for calling toddlers little scientists, because all they do is wander around testing stuff out, putting things in their mouths, saying something and looking at an adult for validation. The whole concept of science is really just a formal codification of what the 2-year-old you know spends their entire day doing. It's the idea of observe, wonder, test, update your ideas, and repeat it. So, because we can wonder, right, we can question how things could be different. And this is what I mean in an experimental kind of format, right? We can, because of that frontal cortex ability, we can intentionally create scenarios that teach us things. So thinking about toddler picking up that thing and putting it in their mouth, right? They can intentionally decide to do that, right? We can go off and say, I don't know if this new compensation program is going to work, so I'm going to test it out in this region. I can create a scenario that I know is going to give me information that's going to be useful. This is the essential concept of experimentation. Observe something, have a question about it, and then to design a scenario where you can test how it works. Experimentation helps us create new information so that we can analyze it and understand what's happening in the world. The understanding part comes back to this idea of interpret, right? Because once we create those scenarios, which is the idea of research methods, we then create data, and then that data we can analyze and interpret so that we can understand what we're seeing in the signals that we've created. Essentially, that cycle has been formalized, and it's what we call the scientific method. That's all it is this circular pattern of understanding, asking a question, setting up a scenario so that we can collect information, interpreting that information, and then using it to observe and wonder new things. That's really it. Now, when we do that cycle a whole bunch of times, we create something called the theory, right? So a theory of plate tectonics, or the theory of evolution, or the theory of relativity, right? These are all not facts so much as they are hundreds of people spending tens of thousands of hours doing hundreds of thousands of experiments, collecting millions of data points that have all pointed to a reasonably reduced set of facts that we call a theory. So this is the first half of what this course is about. And we're not going to do as much with engineering this course, right? But this is it's an important part of being a practitioner. But the first half of our course is really dedicated to understanding this concept, and all the argumentation stuff that we've done about understanding ideas and challenging ideas, you have to bring with you across this whole cycle and constantly be questioning it. So with the last 20, we're going to do 20 minutes, and then I'll have 3 minutes to wrap us up before we go. We're going to break back out into groups, random again. And I want each of you to pick one major scientific theory. It can be anything you want, something that's passionate for you, something you can Google, whatever. I don't care which scientific theory it is, but I want you to answer these 4 questions, right? What was observed and wondered by, I'll use gravity. What is observed and wondered by a scientist? You know, Newton was wondering why things go down, why things fall, right? Why things sit on the earth, why things have weight, right? What did they ask? All of those things, right? What data do you think that they created, right? And then identify a way that that theory has been refined over time. So I'm not sure if you guys got to this section in the book yet. I think it's in chapters in the future. But when we think about I'm going to steal another one from you guys, the heliocentric solar system, right? So the planets go around the sun. We started there by recognizing the fact that stuff didn't really move the way we expected it to move. Stars and stuff didn't move in a way that made any sense. And we initially created this, but then we had to refine it over time because we didn't know everything right away. So that's what we're going to do with the next 20 minutes. Maybe I'm going to do 9 minutes and 9 minutes, so we have a few minutes to wrap up. But I'm going to break you guys all out. Rebecca, you have a question before we go?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, a law, like the law of conservation or law of thermodynamics, is that a theory?
I would go far enough to say yes.
Or is that a law? I don't understand.
Well, a law is really more of like a mathematical principle, right, that has been proven, and it can be used in the support of theories, right? Theories tend to be groups of things that we accept as fact because we've collected enough evidence about them, right? When you hear something called a law, it's typically
The
because
math.
it's mathematically constant, right?
Got it.
But
Thank
it would be, but if you think about like Newton's laws of motion, those 3 motions sort of underpin Newtonian physics, right? Which is more of a theory. Helpful? Okay, cool. All right. Breakout room.
I got it. I got it already for you,
Oh, you
Chris.
got it.
Ready
You're
to
good.
go.
I was wondering why I was clicking and nothing was happening. All
I
right.
got you.
Do it up, Brittany.
All right, going out, guys.
So if anybody's interested in going a little deeper on the syllogisms, I just dropped the YouTube video. It's like 13 minutes. I found it really interesting. If you guys are interested, you can take a look. It's not required or anything. It's just additional stuff if y'all are into it. Brittany's also going to save the chat, and she's going to grab the 2 files I dropped at the beginning of class and this YouTube video so that y'all can have access to it after we close out of today. So we have about 9 minutes if we save 60 seconds to close us out. So what
It
did
looks
y'all
like-
find? How did it go? Oh, Ben, what's
Julie, you
up?
got a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you were going to provide the PowerPoint slide, or is that what was
Eventually.
eventually?
Yeah. So week 1 and I think week 2 are kind of one giant deck right now. I've got to like chop it up. But I will be providing it eventually.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. How did the major scientific theory work go? We got nods. More nods than on the argumentation where it was like, ooh. So someone jump in. Tell me what you guys.
I'll jump in. All right, so Perea and I went with the Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
What was observed and wondered by scientists was how Earth was created from a big asteroid that crashed onto Earth and created the Pangea as we know it, which led to our continents and our human creation after dinosaurs.
So your point is how did Earth essentially become Earth is the wondering.
Yep.
Okay, fair. Then what data do you think they created about that? What kinds of things did they figure out?
They created debris and travel.
Okay.
They did excavation and digging deep into the earth to find a timeline in a way. So I'm pretty like the way we thought of it is like the meteor hits and it now is on there. Now it's debris and it's under, like you have to dig for it And the best way to dig to Earth is going to the core. So the deeper you get, the more you find out about where the Earth is, how they come to form.
Yeah. So archaeology and paleontology provided a lot of evidence that showed us, whoa, Earth is pretty freaking old, man. Carbon dating and all of those things, to your point, created data that we didn't really even know how old Earth was or how old the universe was. But carbon dating and a lot of what we found in archaeology told us it was really, really old. So that's a really good point of data. How did it, what's one major way that it refined over time from a major, maybe something we thought, and then something that we discovered that we didn't know about the theory?
I mean, we went based off bones and skeletons that were found. That tells us a lot about who or what was here before us. Like dinosaur bones, that tells us they were here before us, but they're extinct, so that means they're not here anymore. Another thing, this is more future wise. This is more like creation of advanced technology to discover more, and using this advanced technology to further our learning to finding new and researching new habitable planets.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna add one thing from specifically to like a way that theory has been refined. When we discovered that the universe is expanding, right? We thought the universe was a static thing, right? For a long, long time. And then once we realized everything's getting further away from the center, we were able to reverse engineer our way all the way back to the Big Bang, right? And that's the essence of the Big Bang theory, that we can get all the way back to that singularity, and we can't go back any further than that yet because we don't really understand. But this is a really good example because we thought some stuff. How did the Earth come to be? We started studying. Holy crow, stuff is really old. Holy crow, the universe is really big. Holy crow, the universe is getting bigger. And as we reverse engineer all that all the way back to the Big Bang, it puts all of this stuff together and it's all congruent. So it's a really, really good example. Thank you, Stuart. Who else?
We can go. We did the plate tectonic theory. The what was observed by scientists, the Earth's surface changing. What was asked, we kind of came up with a couple of what we imagined they asked was how earthquakes were caused, how was the Earth's surface changing and expanding, why earthquakes were concentrated in certain areas, and how does the mantle convection cause seafloor spreading. The data we think that was created was the understanding and measurements of the ocean, understanding of volcanoes, canyons, etc., measurements of earthquakes, and even predictivity, the age of the Earth and the changes of the Earth over the centuries, and how it's developed. I mean, it's just kind of shown the age of the Earth and stuff like that, but they also changed the description of it into more of like tectonic powered by subduction and the lithosphere, which then separated the mosaic of plates.
This is a great one because it is something that's reasonably observable, right? When compared with the Big Bang Theory and us wondering, hey, how the heck did the Earth come to be? That's a very abstract kind of existential question versus France looks a little further away than it was last year, right? And I kid, but like they were real observable measurements that we could make. And then that caused another question, which caused another question, which caused another question. And then we realized that, whoa, the east coast of South America looks like it fits real nicely inside of the west coast of Africa. Holy moly, has this been happening for a really, really long time? And then all of a sudden, all that data ticks together and then we can create a geological explanation for it. That's a really, really good one. One more good one.
We discussed the kind of like similar to the first two, the theory of evolution. So we to answer the question like what was observed and wondered by scientists. So the differences between species, they observed fossils, and then they also considered other people's theories, like the Darwin's theory of natural selection. And then in terms of like the kind of questions that they would ask, like why is there such a diverse a diversity amongst human life or life just in general on Earth? Why do organisms develop adaptations to their environments? Are all species related? And then the kind of data that we think they created,
like the fossil records, which provides consistent evidence over time of that systematic change. And then the ways that the theory has changed over time. Ashley mentioned that there's now micro and macro evolution. And then also, kind of like to your point, other theories or maybe like religion itself has also played a big role into how like people view evolution as well.
That's good, Mariah. I want to poke on that a little bit. Think about, or can you tell me a way that the theory evolved? That's a little extra, but like how, like, tell me about a way that the theory of evolution made a big change. Can you think of any times in history where something happened in science that fundamentally shifted how we thought about evolution after, you know, Mendel and his plants and Darwin and his canaries?
I can't think of a specific moment in time.
Anyone got a good one from history class or science class?
Would stem cell research count?
You're getting there. The discovery of DNA.
Oh.
Right? Because up until the discovery of DNA, all of our understanding of how evolution worked were observable characteristics, right? Dark-haired people tend to have dark-haired kids, right? Plants with extra leaves tend to have plants with extra leaves. And we could observe the theory, but then once we got to this level of DNA, that changed the game, because now you take the theory of evolution and you apply it in a fundamental new space. And now we start unpacking DNA and we start to see, holy crow, that's how this works. It's the idea of genetic mutation. Some stick, some don't. And that's how essentially the whole concept works. So that's a great example. And I'm actually going to use it again when we talk tomorrow, or actually next week when we do the HR data system, because a really interesting part of vestigial or of evolution is vestigial things. So things that evolved don't have any use, but they also didn't hurt us, so they didn't go away, right? Things like our tailbone or our appendix, right? And those things you can see in the data. They don't really matter, except for the fact that they tell us something about history, which is really interesting in and of itself. And when we think about how technology works and how technology evolves, one of the things about evolution is that it's fundamentally lazy. It only does what it needs to do to survive. It doesn't do anything extra. It doesn't optimize. And the evolution of science often follows a lot of those same rules. So it's a really good one for us to end on today. So I'm seeing mushrooms in the chat. What's happening over there? Ben, are you helping?
No, that's true.
Fun fact, we're pretty close to, yes, we are. Actually, that is true. That is a true fact. We share a lot of DNA with things you wouldn't expect us to.
Bananas, trees.
So we're about going to close out for the day. I hope you guys all enjoyed week 1. I know you guys have been a cohort together for a while, so you all know each other. But Ben and I have had a pretty good time getting to know you guys this week. There is a small study guide for you guys to ensure that you please complete tomorrow. We're going to review those before we get into lecture tomorrow. We're going to do a little bit more about engineering, and then we're going to move on to some other stuff to close the week out, and then we'll be off to the races for week 2. So thank you guys all for coming. Thank you for your attention. And Ben?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say real quick, there was a question in the chat about when everything opens up for week 2. I think Chris, correct, or Brady, correct me if I'm wrong, that should happen like tomorrow, correct?
It should happen as soon as you and I have Alex unlock it. So we're close.
Okay.
But we're just locking down the last few things, because in the spirit of pilot programming, Ben and I are like right up to the wire on making sure that everything is just so. So
Yep.
they'll be out in the next day or so.
They'll be out in time for you to start and
Yes,
you know, to get it
for
in
sure.
time.
Between today and tomorrow, the goal is for you guys to focus on the little study guide and come prepared to talk tomorrow. And then we'll unlock everything so that you can do your stuff that's due Saturday, and so that you can focus on what's due for Monday.
Okay, and then
Wait,
just a quick question, future reference is, are we gonna be having access to like the next week's work once Tuesday class is over? Is there a plan for that? I just want to kind of align myself with that.
For
Our goal
sure.
is to be, we're shooting for 1 week in advance soon. So by Tuesday or Wednesday, you're going to be able to see all of next week's stuff. And as we get further down, we're hoping to be able to lock 2 weeks out, but we got to make sure everything's locked in before we do that. But that's the goal.
And then so you had said to worry about the study guide. So does that mean that the assignment that was due today at 5 o'clock, I think was titled W1A study guide, something like that?
Yep.
Is that what you're referring to?
There's 2 study guides every week. There's a big study guide that you're doing in advance of lecture, and then there's a little study guide in the lab that you're doing in advance of the lab. So every week you're going to have a big study guide to finish and a little study guide to finish. There will be
Got you.
additional assignments like papers and exercises and things like that. But at the very least, each week, your reading and your writing and all of that stuff is going to be connected to the quiz questions that are connected to the study guide at the end of 2 study guides, big one and little one. Does that make sense?
Got you. Yes, but then with the timings for those, are we going to be now having it at 5 o'clock? Because we had it at 5:50 before. I think it was 5:59, like right before the class started. And like I personally, like I work a 9 hour day, like I do 980s to where I'm prepared to do whatever we have to do. We're here now, but is it possible to have it back at 5:59?
They'll open early enough that you should be able to get them done an hour beforehand. The reason they have to be done an hour before class starts, Tyler, is because Ben and I review them and we want to see what your answers are so that we know how to tweak content based on where we're seeing comprehension and not comprehension. So we need that hour of grace to read it. But the compromise on that is that we're going to open them early enough that you can do them over the course of the weekend so you don't have to wait until Tuesday to do it. So if you want to do the lab one a day early so that you don't have to swing it right on and the day between, you'll be able to do that.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions
So
before we close out?
wait. So it's the B assignment, W1B, that is due tomorrow by 5 o'clock.
Correct. So there's always going to be a study guide in the lecture, and there's always going to be a study guide in the lab. The study guide in the lecture will be called the big study guide, and the study guide in the lab will be called the little study guide. The big ones due Monday, the little ones due Tuesday.
Okay.
And there's
I would definitely
associated
check
videos and
the
readings
wording on it.
with each of them. Does that track?
Okay.
So the videos you're going to watch, the readings you're going to do, the articles we're going to give you, those are all going to be associated with the questions that you need to answer for each study guide. So they'll all be in one study guide package inside of Canvas. Cool? All right. Any other questions before we part ways tonight? All right. Silence is golden. Thank you guys for shepherding Ben and I through our first one of these. I look forward to 7 more weeks.